spelt out very eloquently what the consequences of these wars have been in Afghanistan and Iraq, and of course in Libya, and of course in Syria, because there has been a great deal of intervention going on in recent years. So I think that today we are 12 years into the war on terror. Exactly, it was 12 years ago that George Bush and Tony Blair launched this attack on Kabul, on Afghanistan. In all those years, tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of people died. Afghanistan has one of the worst refugee problems of anywhere in the world. We see about Syrian refugees because it suits the BBC and the government to show those kind of pictures, and there is a terrible humanitarian catastrophe going on there. But the two countries with the worst record of refugees have been Iraq and Afghanistan, and that is still a very, very serious problem and totally connected with the wars in those countries. So if you look today, at the weekend, 4 American soldiers were killed in Afghanistan, the first for some time that have been killed. What we never hear about is that every week this year, at least 100 Afghan soldiers have been killed in the fighting in Afghanistan, and of course all sorts of other people have been killed. The reason I say that is because what they want to do is to hide this war, to sanitise the war, to pretend that it really isn't happening very much because British and American soldiers aren't dying very much. But what they've done is they've contracted it out to the Afghan army, which is taking very, very heavy casualties, and the war is going on in absolutely terrible way in Afghanistan. What has been the consequence of the 12 years of war on terror? I think we could look at 3 things. One is the terrible cost, that it is estimated that up to 1 million people died in Iraq, with up to 4 million refugees there. The Afghan figures we just simply don't know, because they've never been even estimated in that kind of way, and certainly haven't been recorded in the way that they record the deaths of every foreign soldier who dies there. So there's a terrible cost, and not just in terms of death, in terms of injury, in terms of mental and physical health, in terms of birth deformities in places like Fallujah in Iraq. All of these things are things that people are still living with by the day. And when Sami talks about the sectarian divisions which have been deliberately fostered and exacerbated by the occupiers, these are something which is seen regular car bombs and other atrocities, where dozens and dozens of people are killed on a regular basis in various parts of Iraq. And this is a situation which is, if anything, getting worse. So that's the first consequence, is the terrible cost of the deaths. The second is the spread of terrorism. When the war on terror was launched, it was launched against Afghanistan because the argument was that the Taliban government in Afghanistan, which was an extremely unpopular authoritarian government, was a government which was giving, which was protecting Osama bin Laden and was giving sustenance to Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda then existed in Afghanistan. The Taliban was defeated very, very quickly because the Taliban had no air force, had very little army, had no means of defending itself against the United States. The Al-Qaeda, bin Laden and all the others went off to the border lands with Pakistan, where bin Laden was killed, 2 years ago now. But the truth is, since then, there's been the spread of terrorism and the spread of Al-Qaeda across large parts of Africa now, across large parts of the Middle East, in countries like Yemen and in Syria and in all these other places. Far from it being means of stopping terrorism, the war on terror has actually bred and created terrorism, not least in countries like Britain. We know the events of 2005 and 7/7, we know the events in Woolwich earlier this year were directly connected, as was made absolutely clear by the people who carried them out, were directly connected to the war on terror and to the opposition to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and everywhere else. And indeed, if you remember what bin Laden said, the reason he gave in 2001 for the attacks of 9/11, he said, "We are protesting about the sanctions on Iraq." Since then, which killed 500,000 children, the sanctions, since then, far worse things have happened to the people of Iraq. They were opposed to the position of the Palestinians and the way in which Israel treats the Palestinians. Can anybody say, 12 years after that the position of the Palestinians has got better? No, it's got worse with the settlements, with the bombing of Gaza, with all the other things we've seen in the last 12 years. And the third thing was that bin Laden objected to US troops on Saudi soil. Well, now there are US troops all over the Middle East and in parts of Africa, so all of that has got worse. The third thing, the consequence of the war on terror, is of course that the interventions have continued and continued and continued. First Afghanistan, then Iraq, then Libya, and then the attempt at the intervention in Syria. Now, to me, the vote in the House of Commons in August, which stopped David Cameron going to war in Syria, which is what he and Barack Obama were going to do, was a fantastic achievement for our movement and was a fantastic victory for all those who want peace and stability in the world. They were prepared. If that vote had gone the other way, we would now be 2 months into God knows what state of horror in Syria and elsewhere. And you know, when people say there has to be a response to chemical weapons, I'd like to make it absolutely clear. I'm totally opposed to chemical weapons. Whoever uses them, whoever is responsible for them, I don't think they should be manufactured, I don't think they should be sold, and I don't think they should be used. But the idea that bombing by cruise missiles or any other way, that the kind of airstrikes that were being planned would have resulted in somehow people not being killed in very large numbers, was simply fantasy. And we know in every one of the interventions, in Afghanistan and Iraq and Libya, they always used the excuse of humanitarian intervention. They always said, we're doing this to help the women, we're doing this to help the refugees, we're doing it to help the people who are under attack from a dictator. And in every case, the deaths and the injuries were worse than they had been before this took place. So in every case, this was a problem. So I think it was a fantastic victory for us in August that David Cameron was forced to retreat, and that then Barack Obama was forced to say he would go to Congress to get a vote, and then he realised that he couldn't win a vote in Congress, and then they were forced to do what any sensible route would be, which is to say, is there a diplomatic route? And I mean, I went on the BBC and this reporter said to me, well, they've tried diplomacy. That is a complete lie. They've never tried diplomacy in Syria. In fact, the United States has always blocked any kind of peace talks or any way of moving in that direction, either by saying that Assad can't be represented or by saying Iran can't be represented or whoever else and they always say this is the opposition in Syria saying this, but as everybody knows, they have a lot of influence over what the opposition in Syria says. So they could have gone in this direction long before they started pouring in weapons and money and special forces and all the other things that they did. So that was a real victory for us, a very, very important victory for us. And it also has meant a very big change vis-a-vis Iran, which I think we should be aware is a change that's been forced on Obama, that he's had to develop a more conciliatory attitude towards Iran, but that actually this has now meant that Israel is completely opposed to this policy, and Israel is making all sorts of noises about still wanting to attack Iran and saying that the Americans have been duped and everything else. Now, we stopped that war, and that's very important, but do any of us seriously think this is the end of the danger? We still have nearly 100,000 troops in Afghanistan. The foreign troops are still there. There is still a terrible war in Afghanistan, and the truth is that even in a year's time, when the Americans are supposed to withdraw, and we should take that with a great pinch of salt, the truth is there will still be all the problems in Afghanistan for the people there to have to deal with. But this isn't the end of empire, and we shouldn't for a minute believe that it is. If you look at what is happening, what has been Obama's response to this? Well, you know, you launch a Navy SEALs raid on Somalia to try and capture the leader of Al-Shabaab, and unfortunately for them, that failed. He got away, so they can't make a film about this. So I suppose they could. They did make one about Black Hawk Down, so I suppose maybe they could. But it hasn't got a happy ending as far as the Americans are concerned. And Obama, who 2 years ago watched the assassination of bin Laden on a television screen, was apparently planning to do the same thing over Shabab over Al-Shabaab in Somalia this week. So they lose, they don't manage to capture the Al-Shabaab leader in Somalia. So what do? They go and kidnap somebody in Libya, somebody they obviously knew where they were, how they could pick them up on the same day. In other words, the United States will turn more towards this kind of individual approach, and trying to take out particular individuals that they want to arrest or to assassinate, or any of those other kind of things. And this is a very dangerous situation. It's also a dangerous situation because we are not by any means out of the wood in terms of the Middle East. While there is a fundamental antagonism, not just in terms of Israel, but in terms of Saudi Arabia, which has doubled its arms spending in recent years, and which is becoming military power in the region, and which has a fundamental antagonism towards Iran, you are talking about the dangers of war anywhere in the region. Very, very serious for us. So it seems to me we managed to succeed over this, but we still have a much bigger job to do, and that means that what we have to do is to continue to campaign. And I suppose next year we have NATO summit coming to Britain, and we don't know where or when. They'll find probably some castle somewhere in the north of Scotland or somewhere else to have it, but we need to make sure that we can get there and demonstrate and do all this kind of thing. But we need to keep on the streets and keep organising, and Sammy's absolutely right, to keep educating and discussing and arguing about what we think is happening, because we do not get from the media anything like the truth. We do not get the full picture of what is going on, and we don't get certainly the full picture of the catastrophe that these wars have been. My final point is this, that I think one of the important things that the vote in Parliament, you know, it's always put by the media that this is because there were sections of the Tory party were unhappy, sections of the Labour Party were unhappy, and it's all put in terms of these kind of individual conflicts between MPs and between the establishment and all these things. Actually, the MPs who voted against the war in August did what they didn't have the guts to do 10 years ago, and that is to defeat a government over a war which was wrong. And the reason that they did it this time is because they knew that Iraq was wrong. And that was because not just what we argued 10 years ago, but what we've argued ever since. All the demonstrations, all the meetings, all the arguments, all the trade union resolutions, all the other things. And one of the important things that happened this year as well was that the Trade Union Congress actually took a decision to oppose the Syria war and to support Stop the War, which is they didn't even do back in 2003. That tells you the power of protest, it tells you the power of argument, it tells you the power of being mobilised and being organised on the streets. And far from it being the case that we can stop doing that, we have to continue to do that until all these wars are ended.